Sorry again for the delay. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Institute of Financial Economics Second Symposium on Economic Policy, entitled Challenges Facing Lebanon's Banking Sector. The Institute of Financial Economics was formerly known as the Institute of Money and Banking, as many of you know. It was founded in 1983 thanks to the efforts of Dr. Makdisi and the generosity of 5 leading banks, Audi, Blom, BLF, Biblos, and Crédit Libanais. One of Lebanon's main pillars is its banking sector and financial institutions. This sector has been one of the most successful since the 1950s, rendering Lebanon a regional financial hub. For many years, the country reaped the benefits of the banking secrecy law enacted in 1956. The bank's operations throughout this time period were overseen by the Banque du Liban and the Banking Control Commission. In an effort to help combat money laundering, tax evasion, and other forms of criminal activity, the Lebanese monetary authorities have recently taken some important steps, which will be covered in more details by Mr. Hamoud. I will briefly mention here 3 of them. The Special Investigation Commission, created in 2015 to fight money laundering and terrorism financing. The legislature passed the Anti-Money Laundering AML law in 2001. The Central Bank of Lebanon Circular 128/2013 requiring all banks operating in Lebanon to set up an in-house compliance department, including a unit for complying with AML measures and counteracting the financing of terrorism. More recent challenges include making sure that banks are in compliance with the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, the one we all know as FATCA, as well as other acts and measures by the US government. I think there is common agreement that the performance of the banks and the authorities has been very successful so far. However, a question to be asked, will the banks still be able to play their crucial role in economic development amidst all these regulations and compliance efforts? Today, we will be hearing from our panelists their views about how the banks have fared in facing the recent challenges and their outlook regarding future challenges and how these may be overcome. So now I will give the floor to Dr. Makdisi, who will be moderating this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leila. And of course, in turn, I would like to welcome our distinguished panelists who will brief us on what has been happening to the banking system, the challenges they have been facing, the role that the regulatory authorities have been playing, as well as what the government plans to do and has been doing in this regard. How shall I introduce you? As a graduate of the Institute of Money and Banking, or as a Minister of Economy? What about?
Graduate of Economics and Money and Banking.
Over the years, of course, the challenges facing the banks have been both internal and external. I mean, internally, the banks have been facing the issue of fiscal deficits, mounting fiscal deficits, huge fiscal deficits. And as some of you may remember that in October, the IFE did hold a panel on the subject to see how this problem can be resolved. Not only fiscal deficits, but of course the external things that are beyond the control of banks are regional developments, regional political issues that impact the domestic economic and monetary situation. Only this past month, the country faced a momentous political crisis with its own specific negative monetary implications, and hopefully we are going to get out of it, because it seems that it is being controlled, it's coming under control. And clearly, the banking system is closely affected by all these developments, and its operations are intricately influenced by whatever measures the monetary authorities take in order to cope with the emergent situations. But apart from challenges facing external developments which are beyond the control of the banking system or banks, banks have been dealing with tasks relating to their own performance and the implementation of prudential policies aimed at a continuously improving regulatory environment. Perhaps and this is my own point of view, one can state that overall, the banking system has made good progress in this regard, though the record of individual banks does vary from one bank to another. But no doubt, major challenges or tasks remain to be accomplished that this panel will take up. Now, for the purpose of coordinating the flow of the commentary of our distinguished guests, I shall first give the floor to Freddie Baz, Vice Chairman of the Board of Audi Bank, to comment on the role and importance of the banking sector in the national economy and briefly outline major issues currently being faced by the banks and how they intend to cope with these challenges. I will then give the floor to Samir Hammoud, Chairman of Lebanon's Banking Control Commission, to discuss the role and the effectiveness of banking regulations in promoting banking and monetary stability, as well as measures that have recently been taken or are under consideration to meet emerging challenges in the monetary and banking sectors. Finally, I will give the floor to Ra'ed Khouri, Lebanon's Minister of Economy and Trade, to speak on governmental policies aimed at ensuring national economic and financial stability. How successful have these policies been? What challenges does the emerging political situation pose? And how do the responsible authorities plan to meet these challenges? May I suggest 20 to 25 minutes for each panelist, and then we can take it from there. Freddie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Samir, for the opportunity you are giving me again to come to UB and to address such a nice audience. I believe that the topic is also very timely, despite the academic forum. After all the criticism and the systemic attacks the banking system has been subject to over the last several months, ranging mainly from its pseudo-exuberant profits within the current tough socioeconomic conditions in Lebanon towards some reluctance in assuming our basic functions. Now, we understand that those criticism and attacks happened at a time there was lengthy and tough discussions on the salary scale adjustment law and the required financing for this law, along with the first public debate on the 2017 budget law, the first one in 10 or 12 years. So it was a good opportunity for populist speeches ahead of the planned forthcoming parliamentary elections next year, because we all know that those criticisms were untrue and unfair. They were lacking objectivity and professionalism, and to a large extent also lacking some business ethics, especially emanating from media, politicians, and surprisingly, at times, from civil society forces. So I will try probably to put things in the right perspective in order to really understand what is the role and the importance, as you have requested, Samir, of the banking sector in Lebanon. My understanding between role and importance, I would consider importance as a metric for the weight of the banking industry in the economy. It's not, very, very important, because banks represent merely 7% of GDP in Lebanon, and they employ a mere 1.5% of the total active population. But despite this relatively small contribution to labor and GDP formation, in terms of tax paying, banks have always been paying taxes much in excess of their relative weight in the economy. Just to give you some metrics, we represent 7% of GDP, whereby income taxes, taxes on profits collected by the government, banks contribute up to 31%. So 7% versus 31%. And if we have to adjust to the new taxes, which will put a big burden on banks, the ratio on a pro forma adjusted basis would become 41%. So we'll be contributing up to 40% of total taxes on profits collected for a 7% contribution to GDP. It's a major discrepancy. And if we look at the withholding taxes on salaries and wages, we do represent 25% of the total, although our labor force represent only, as I said, 1.4% of the total active population. I mean, we are happy to do this. We are not complaining. Probably this is the price to pay for transparency and governance. We are happy to do it, but it's very important also for the common people in Lebanon to know about, I mean, this important effort undertaken by banks. Now, if we look at the role versus importance, this is something which is completely different because the banks are assuming a very big and important role. I will try to give you disorderly, I will try to throw disorderly some remarks in order to trigger later on maybe Q&As. First of all, in terms of financial intermediation in Lebanon is dominantly banking. Now, if we look at the size of the financial markets, which represent close to $310 billion in Lebanon, bank assets, domestic obviously, represent 70%, 213 out of 307. But when we look at the other components, which are the equity capital markets and debt capital markets, and we know that the banks represent 80% of the market cap at the BSE, and banks hold 44% of total fixed income instruments, which are mainly public sector instruments. So by adjusting for this, real weight or real intermediation goes beyond 90%. And this is very well reflected in the national savings collection and also in the lending which is provided to the domestic economy. In terms of national savings collection, you all know that domestic deposits in Lebanon represent more than 3 times GDP, which gives a real measure about the savings attraction capacity of banks. It's by any standard a huge figure. But when we look off balance sheet also, there is another $24 billion which are managed off balance sheet, broken down over $4 billion in fiduciary deposits, and the remaining being assets under management. Now, there is very little statistics in Lebanon about the resident assets which are managed outside the banking industry. But when we consider that what is managed within represent close to 4 times GDP, there is very little remaining elsewhere. In terms of lending to the domestic economy in its both components of public and private sectors, and also in its both components of investments and consumption, figures are also very explicit. At September end 2017, there was $108 billion of outstanding loans to the private and public sector. I'm considering loans, only loans to the resident private sector at $53 billion, which represent almost 1 time GDP, and there is a lot of criticism that banks are not lending. We have, an overall exposure of 1 time GDP, and I will remind that the Southeast Asian 1997 crisis occurred after foreign investors, they get aware about the high exposure of local banks to the domestic economy. At the time, it was 70%. It had generated a lot of concerns, translating into massive exits with all the relating volatility. So at 100% of exposure, at 100% of GDP exposure to the domestic private sector, I believe that there is very little room for criticism that banks are not doing much, especially that the breakdown of loans to the private sector have been evolving gradually over the last 10 years towards the retail and SMEs to the detriment of corporate and commercial, despite the fact that if we have to benchmark to similar countries in terms of per capita income, there is still a big effort to do in order to better reflect the standard of living and welfare. As a matter of comparison, if I take Mexico and Turkey, which have similar per capita incomes than Lebanon, retail and SME represent 60% of total loans, whereby in Lebanon they are still at 40%. But we are coming from a very low level, which means that banks have been contributing significantly over the last several years into the re-emergence of the middle class in Lebanon, as witnessed by the retail loans and the mortgages, more importantly. Today we have $12 billion of outstanding mortgages, which bears witness of this effort. Now, when I say that our total exposure represents 1 time GDP, it means that banks are also significantly participating or significantly fueling growth in Lebanon with respect to the historically very high correlation between loans to the private sector in Lebanon and GDP growth rates. Now, if we add to those $53 billion, 33 billion of claims on the public sector, and we add over and above the $22 billion equivalent of CDs in local currencies, the central bank CDs in local currencies, which we are holding in our portfolios for a very simple reason. I'm not adding other CDs, I'm adding only those CDs because they are backing the central bank subscription in local treasuries in order to avoid the monetization of that. So it's as if banks are also financing the public sector indirectly through those CDs, which are used by the central bank to back their subscription in local treasuries. We get to the $108 billion. And as a matter of fact, when we look at the outstanding debt of Lebanon today, it's held up to 42% by local banks, just to bear witness also of the important support which is provided. Within the context of a yearly financing for up to 65% of the budget deficit. What can I tell you more about the role? You know that we are an importing and a consumer economy in Lebanon. Foreign trade turnover represents on average 50% of GDP. If we add imports and exports as a percentage of GDP, it's 50%. Over all those years, throughout the cumulative LC openings over the years, banks have been financing between 80 and 85% of Lebanon foreign trade. As I said, which is too big with respect to the size of the economy, but this is mainly driven by those recurrent inflows which are translating into a disposable income for Lebanese, which is by all times, by all means, much above, the domestic income, and therefore justifying those important imports. Household consumption represent close to 80% of GDP in Lebanon, and imports represent 50% of household consumption. So this is something which is critical with respect to the lack of food self-sufficiency in Lebanon. Which bears witness also of the very strategic role played by bank into ensuring, the financing of all those imports. Lebanon also, it's in our constitution, is a free and open economy, and there is free exchange and transfers, and the transfers have always represent a pivotal activity in Lebanese banks. And we are not talking about small figures. Those are not published, but I mean, we can extrapolate them. First of all, I can do it throughout my bank because I know what's happening in my bank. We have $14 billion of yearly inward and outward cumulative transfers. We represent 14% of the market, which means that the size is almost $100 billion. Probably Samir, will comment on this figure because they know better than we do because they have the consolidated statistics. But when we look at the balance of payment, the comprehensive breakdown of the BOP as published by the IMF and the BDL, it's not difficult to conciliate and to reach almost, those levels of yearly inward and outward transfers. And this is, the sensitivity and the importance of compliance among Lebanese banks. But still, we are almost the only channel of inward and outward transfers in a free and open economy like Lebanon, which is counting significantly on those inflows in order to finance its distorted, I would say, long-lasting distorted structures. I'm not trying to justify that the model, is good, but the model being what it is, do require such recurrent, inflows towards Lebanon, and banks represent the main channel for those inflows. Maybe also I will add another role which started maybe 10 years ago in expanding outside of Lebanon and contributing also to the regionalization of the Lebanese economy. Banks have been at the forefront, as witnessed by their achievement so far, since we have succeeded into building organically close to $40 billion of assets outside of Lebanon. As per the Association of Bank Statistics, there is 18 banks which have expanded into 32 countries since 2005. But it's not evenly, broken down, since Saudi by itself have achieved 50% of the total turnover outside of Lebanon in terms of assets, loans, and deposits. But still, there is a big number of banks which have expanded outside of Lebanon, which have started by creating important business franchise for the country, translating into the generation of an interesting value added, which a big chunk of it is repatriated every year inside the country, because we are being distributed, obviously, our profit generated abroad. Last year, for instance, Lebanese banks have achieved $700 million of profits in their foreign branches and subsidiaries, and it's an important value added created for the country. Those are, some quick figures and numbers just to give the magnitude of the important role which is played by the banking industry in Lebanon in order to create value, to support jobs, and to make the Lebanese economy, obviously, improve, despite the fact that the Lebanese economy has been lagging recently. We are at $54 billion of GDP, whereby the steady state level of GDP, as per the IMF, which is the GDP would have achieved today should the war of the 70s and the 80s never occurred, would have been at $120 billion, which is a better reflection of our ambition as Lebanese for our own standard of living and welfare. And as a matter of fact, there is very little people which knows that in 1974, at the eve of the civil war in Lebanon, GDP per capita in Lebanon used to represent 70% of that of Singapore. Today we are living in two different worlds. GDP per capita in Lebanon represent a mere 10 or 11% of that of Singapore. But what happened, and we cannot just, redo history. What is frustrating today, and it's one of the main challenges we are facing, is the cyclical output gap, which, we are not closing, and which represent, 20-25% of the actual output. So there is a yearly foregone income as per today's stock of capital. So I'm not talking anymore about the war and its impact on the stock of capital. With respect to the current stock of capital of Lebanon, there is a yearly $15 billion, minimum $15 billion of foregone income, which are distributed over profits and wages. For the corporate sector to which we belong, it's as if we can generate 30% more revenues almost on the same cost base. So this is, I mean, very, very harmful. And I don't know to which extent, I mean, responsible of this foregone income are really aware about it. I mean, obviously, politicians which are lacking into improving the investment climate in order to promote investments and to catch up. And in terms of wages, broadly, it's very difficult, I mean, to assess the contribution of salaries versus profits, you know, in national income today. But, I mean, just to simplify, if we divide the foregone income 50-50 between profits and wages, it's as if we are, every single household can get $500 more of monthly income in Lebanon, which they are not getting. Now, I would like very quickly, sorry?
How much time is still need?
You told me 25 minutes. I'm at 20 minutes, so I have 5 minutes. I'm very disciplined. Talking about profits, because I told you that this was a major criticism that banks are doing, I mean, exuberant profits. People are driven by figures in absolute terms, maybe $2 billion. I mean, because I mean, Lebanese banks are achieving $2 billion in yearly profits. But what is the benchmark? Why people are surprised that banks are achieving $2 billion in yearly profits? We do represent 7% of GDP, correct? Why people are not looking at the remaining $52 billion? Now, it's not all profits, it's true. If we look at GDP from a national income standpoint, and we adjust for the interest component, which is important, and many other exemptions, let's say we get to 40 billion between profits and salaries. Even if we give 60%, 65%, I mean, to profits, 7% represent $2 billion. So banks are achieving the relative weight in GDP. But there is 22, 23, 24 billion other profits which are generated. No one is looking at them. But it's not the issue for me. The issue is that probably people are not aware, or they don't look at things in relative terms. Because those profits need to be compared with the invested capital by shareholders. Especially that the shareholders in Lebanese banks are private sector shareholders. We don't have public sector shareholding in Lebanese banks. And those are committing their own funds into risky businesses because they are expecting some kind of a reward. What is the benchmark for a reward on an investment? 10%. The minimum is cost of equity. If you earn your cost of equity, you are not creating value to yourself. In other words, the metric for a fundamental value of a bank share is its sustainable ROE as a percentage of the hurdle rate, the hurdle rate being the cost of equity. In other words, if you are achieving 16% sustainable ROE, which is currently the cost of equity in Lebanon, your share should trade fundamentally at one-time book. So you're not creating value to yourself, because if you invest or if you acquire a bank share, it's to get some market added value with time. In Lebanon, if you look at ROEs that are published, over the last 10 years, Lebanese banks have been achieving 11.5% average ROE over the last 10 years, whereby the cost of equity over the same period have been 16%. So we are not earning our cost of capital. And as a matter of fact, if you divide the 11.5%, 12% over 16%, it gives you 1.75%, which is currently the average price to book of Lebanese banks. So there is no miracles, no mysteries. People wonder why bank stocks in Lebanon are trading at below book, because banks are underperforming in terms of profits. And this is the main challenge, because this is related to the persisting fiscal imbalances, which are translating into high risk premiums and high cost of equity considerations, exerting pressures on profitability and internal cap generation. Thanks God, within the context of still very good levels of asset quality and liquidity, which are among the best in the region. And the cyclical output gap also, which is depriving banks from the quantity effect, because I mean, this is what will provide the growth, because improving our conditions comes from size, which is the quantity effect, and from efficiency gains or improved operating conditions, which is the price effect. Price effect is under pressure because of the fiscal imbalances, persisting fiscal imbalances, exerting pressures on risk premiums. We have spreads at 2%, whereby in Turkey they are at 3.75%. In Egypt they are at 3.50%. In Jordan they are at 3.50%. Why in Lebanon spreads hover around 2%? I mean, this is because of those fiscal imbalances. So it's very important, I mean, to keep in mind that the $2 billion probably, I mean, look important for ignorance, but all the parties which have been criticizing banks for their profits, they are not all ignorant. There is a lot of devious also, I mean, parties, I mean, and this is something which is very harmful, because creating concerns about banks, especially with respect to the important role banks have been, you know, assuming, as I tried, I mean, to provide it with figures and numbers. It's something which is very dangerous. I mean, I can afford saying it here because this is an academic forum. Probably I won't say it, you know, elsewhere. You cannot play in the collective subconscious, especially with respect to such a critical sector which is responsible of the money creation. Banks create money, not the central bank. The central bank creates the central bank money. But bank deposits make loans, make deposits. We provide loans. And deposits represent the bulk of the money supply. So we are responsible for the currency. And we should never forget what Stalin said. If you want to destroy a country, you only need to destroy its currency. So it's very sensitive to play with currency. It's very sensitive, you know, to influence this collective subconscious in order, you know, to shake the confidence. This is, I mean, very, very harmful. Probably I will
Come back to that.
Yeah.
Would you like us to ask for tax reduction for banks, income tax?
You know, okay, I will consider it as a question, but I would like to answer it later on.
Okay.
Okay?
I have 5 questions for you.
Okay.
Samir.
Yeah. Thank you, Samir. Notwithstanding with what has been said by Freddie is, to me, is the figures buzz. He's a man of figures. Every time I talk a figure here, please take it as an approximate. It's not exact. And every time I'm describing a situation, it is not meant to be a peculiar bank, a small or a big or a medium bank. I'm talking about the banking sector as a whole. So, not to mislead you. The topic is talking about the challenges of the banking sector. I would say that the challenges of the banking sector can be illustrated in the following 3 questions. Is the present and the current business model sustainable? What Freddie has talked about. Is it sustainable? I'm concerned as a Banking Control Commission. Second, does the current ownership structure warrant continuity? The current ownership structure of the banking sector? Third, will technology advancement turn banks dispensable? We stop needing banks? These questions, if I am answering the first one, talking about the business model, I agree with what he said. Let's make somehow a summary. that if our economy is dollarized, and we have 3.5 times the size of the banking sector to the GDP, and we have loans to deposits in the range of 35%, really we have two problems. We have the problem of profitability, and we have a problem of economic burden of the economy. 3.5 times of the GDP. Who's bearing? Who's paying the cost of this mass money? 35% loans to deposits. Do you think any banking sector in the world can live and sustain with 35% loans to deposits? Look at Europe. Look at the West, look at the East. Look at China, wherever you look. There is no banking sector that can live with 35% loans to deposits. So we have a serious problem. I am concerned about profitability of the banks. And I'm concerned about the cost, economic cost of this money mass. What is the solution? The profitability could be solved. And we were clever in solving the problem of profitability of the banking sector. I admit we have very clever bankers in Lebanon, and we have very good banks in Lebanon. But we turned from banking sector to banking system, where we introduced the central bank with this banking sector. And we acted that, we guarantee, and we made the profits of the banks by taking their excess deposits, either lending to the public sector in the range of 22%, and taking the rest, around 50% of the bank's deposits are now placed with the central bank in foreign currency and local currency at rewarding interest. Prior to 1984, I was a banker and I was to work in the bank. We would pay any depositor, irrespective of the huge amount he has with our banks, we can pay him the maximum of LIBOR minus a fraction, 1/64%, just to make the spread for us. And when I say that with the placement, I was placing the money outside, that the economic cost of the money mass is not on the country. It was taken from outside. Now, the banks are putting their money with the central bank. The central bank is acting also a role of intermediation with the government and paying rewarding interest where the banks are making their money. Yes, I admit, we cannot operate normally under abnormal situation. We are in a sick position. We are giving serum to this patient. I'm not saying that he has good muscles. So we cannot put out this serum from the patient. He will die. So the banking sector, the banking system, is maintaining the life of the economy because of this procedure. But as a controller, as a banker, is this business model sustainable? A question that could be raised. This is a challenge. I am looking forward to see the banks, again, playing their role in the mediation between the deficit units and the surplus units, between the savers and the business units. And I want these banks, I agree, to see them, the Lebanese bank, externalize their operations to outside, where we can have here a positive capital inflow and a positive balance of payment. But this is not the situation right now. The cost, the burden, economic burden on the economy is very high, this mass, and we cannot reduce the size of this mass. We want the dollars. We want to protect our economy and our situation and to protect our Lebanese pound. We'll continue to look for more and more dollars from outside, irrespective of the economic cost, because we know that the health of the country is not yet recovered. Hopefully, in the coming near future, it will recover. Second, does the current ownership structure warrant continuity? The banking sector as a whole, as I said, I'm not talking about a peculiar bank, but this is the characteristics of the banking sector as a whole, owned by families or family legacy. So, and when I'm talking about that, I want to say that this is also a loophole a shortfall, that we cannot continue with that because the common equity tier 1 cannot be increased but from two sources. One, injection of fresh capital, and the second, the retained earning. So if we are to rely totally on a somehow limited capital base, the growth of the banking sector would become somehow a hindrance. It's something very hard. So we want to expand that capital base. And when we expand the capital base, we will be then reaching a real governance. Now, the supervisory and the central bank issued circulars saying the board of directors should be consistent of 3 types of members. One, executive board member, the second, non-executive board member, and the third, independent. And you know the complaints from the banks? They are costly. Why should we? Why you are increasing too many members and also each one to share a committee? So the independent, we want to have some people that have experience in the financial and banking from the university expert and university somehow instructors and from everywhere to come and also participate in the decision, in the strategy, in the planning of these banks. Not only related to the executive or related to the executive, we say that non-executive but not independent in a sense that they are related to the owners of the bank. The capital base should be widened. This is another challenge of the banking sector. The third question I would be saying, will fintech or the technology advancement turn banks dispensable? This is the talk now of today. We are looking for the future. We are talking about the blockchain. We talk about blockchain. We talk about the Bitcoin. And frankly speaking, as supervisor, as also even regulator, we do not have too much information about them. And we fear them. We are not approaching them. But we are trying somehow, step by step, to understand, to have awareness, to regulate them, to go into the reg tech. How we can regulate something that you do not know, you do not understand? Is that somehow a virtual, really currency that will not exist? Is this a fictitious? What is that? No. I strongly believe could be the virtual currency somehow has some its dangers, but the blockchain, something is a book of importance that may somehow make a revolution in the business, in the administration, in the management level. Blockchain is important. We have to understand it. We have to go deep into it. We are not afraid of the digital currency. We are afraid of the virtual currency because we believe that the virtual currency carries 4 risks that we should encounter and also we should meet them. One, the most important one that we want to know, who is the bank of last lender? Who is the bank of last resort? Who is that clearing bank? Because whatever you say about the banking sector, if there is no a clearing bank called the bank of last lender and last resort, the central bank, the banking system with the creation of the money will be somehow shortcut, will be shortcut. Who is that the bank of the clearing bank? We do not know. It is algorithm. And it's might be, I consider it is a type of barters on digital barter. So there is no clearing bank. The second that we are also taking another risk is the AML, the anti-money laundering. We have a phobia in Lebanon on the compliance. It is not a matter that we are exercising our homework or we are exercising a job. No, it's a phobia to the banking sector in Lebanon. We do not agree to say that Lebanon is a land of money laundering. No, this is not true. The banking system and the banking sector is not a sector to launder and to money laundering. On the contrary, every bank is exercising his utmost attention and also the maximum control on every cent coming into his books. He has not only to know the customer and his customer under KYC, he has to know his transactions, the transactions of his customers. What is the customer putting, from where he is coming with that money, and why is he using that money? So the banks know they are exercising their utmost, and the central bank is not lenient. And also the treasury of the state and all the international parties are satisfied with the somehow compliance efforts made by Lebanon. And the fourth, I would say, the risk, and also important, is the systemic or the system operation risk. I agree with Bitcoin. I agree with the blockchain. The human error could be lessened, could be less, but the system error is enormous, is very big, that we do not know if it happens any break in the system, where it leads us and takes us. So these are extremely important. From our side, we are, yes, very much concerned about the profitability of the banking system. And we do not look at the profitability of the banks as somehow exaggerated return on assets, return on equity. We understand that it is even lower than the neighboring countries and other countries. And when it happened in 2016, that the banking sector got a big amount of profits resulting from the financial engineering, we immediately put some pressure on the banks, and we use these excess profits into somehow covering the impairment. Second, into or covering the requirement of IFRS 9, that this is the expected credit loss provisions amounting to 2% of the credit portfolio. And third, we also ask them to go up with their capital adequacy ratio from 12% to 15% in order to absorb these profits not to be distributed as dividends. So what you are saying, these banks made money, they made money to capitalize. They capitalize to make them attractive, to attract more deposits, because we want more deposits in foreign currency to come from outside. If you do not see and show these banks are qualified and also well capitalized, they cannot expand in their deposits. And these banks, the only units that will bring us the money from outside and bring us the dollars. For that reason, as also a regulator and supervisor, we care very much for their governance, for their profitability, for their capital, and for their personnel. I think it is within time, and thank you.
Thank you, Samir. No, but why? Why was it to clap for?
Because he started directly before you have the chance.
No,
The next
no
I
discrimination.
have 5 questions for you.
The government.
And I immersed myself. What he got, he will pay me back 20% of it. No issue.
Okay. Can I merge from now?
Right, the government position, please, and your policies. What shall we do?
Okay, let me start. First of all, I'm wearing here 2 hats. First, because I'm a banker, and I've been so since I graduated from AUB. And then my other hat is being a Minister of Economy for 1 year now. So let me start by describing the situation, the model that we have now as economy, and definitely the banking is the model. Yes, I am worried because the game that we have been playing, or we have been using, which was very attractive since the beginning of, or the end of the war in the 1990s, had contributed very much to the growth and development and professionalism of a banking sector that we should all be proud of. However, what happened is, during that period, is a discrepancy between the monetary policy and the fiscal government policies. I.e., the banking sector has been, and this is because it's a private sector, first of all, because we know in Lebanon that the private sector is much better than the government in performance and anything else. And second, because also the regulator played a very positive role since the 1990s. What happened is that the banking sector grew, and the economy and the fiscal and the government did not move in parallel. So it was lagging. What does this mean? I mean, you know, the banking sector in all the world is, the use of the banking is to facilitate trade, is to facilitate the economy, is to create credit, is to, it's a lubricant of the economy. It's like the oil in an engine. But what happened is the banking became the engine, and this is wrong. And this is major thing that we need to be aware of, and then we need to fix. The government, since the government policies since 1990s was not concentrating on sustainable sectors. They were not looking at how to put all the measures to create good industries, productive industries that are sustainable. Even agriculture, also they did not put any policy regarding any agriculture, or even بقولوا بلد خدمات and tourism. We really did not put all our resources and all our policies to promote this sector as well. We only relied on occasional tourism from our friends in the Gulf. That's it. This is the government. The government did only this. So what happened is the following. The government started to incur debt, and the banking sector was growing, attracting deposits because it created confidence. We have stabilization of the Lebanese pound, and all this was okay. And then the government, instead of taking this money and putting it in productive sectors, it did not do so. This money went into some corruption, unproductive sectors, and creating and not investing it fully in the infrastructure. So as a result of that, now where we stand? We stand as a banking sector of more than 180 billion of deposits with a GDP of 54 billion. And this is not healthy, and I think it's not sustainable. What we need to do is we need to make other sectors of the economy grow as banks, and not to make the banking sector shrink to the other sectors, as some people think. And I agree, the banking in Lebanon is doing its job. It's lending to the economy. The lending is 1 time the GDP, which is great, which is huge. But the problem is not that. The problem is the size of deposits that now we have, which is not creating any more value to the economy, as Mr. Samir Hammoud said. And now it's all cost on us. Why? Because we are repeating the same mistakes in 25 years. We did not create a sustainable economy. We only rely on Lebanese people living outside, making money, attracting their dollar deposit to Lebanon, and then what are we doing with that? Nothing. So this we need to be aware of, and we need to, I'm telling you that because I'll come where I want to come and tell you what we are doing as a government right now. So just to dig a little bit on the numbers of the GDP and the debt over GDP, which this number for me is critical, which is around how much? 350?
150.
Debt?
150.
150, sorry, that is 150. So I'm afraid to tell you that let us analyze our GDP and not look at it as only GDP. GDP, you know, probably you are economics or business people, it's C plus I plus G plus export minus imports. The C alone is 52 billion. And this is because of 2 things. First, because we are spenders, our behavior are spenders, but more importantly, because we have money in our pockets, because the banks has $170, $80 billion. And they are lending, and they are employing people, and they are creating money in the economy. Imagine, so this number, the C, is very high. It's highly alarming. It's good that the C, and usually in other economies, to be high, like 40, 50%, 60% in developed economy like the US. But when it reaches 100%, there's something wrong. We are a consumer economy, and this is also very alarming. So the constitution of our GDP, which we are happy it's 54 billion, if you look at it in terms of risk and in terms of constitution, it is less than that. Because part of it is C, and the C is depending on these deposits in the banks. And then the I, which is the investment. Now, we don't have much investment in Lebanon. We want to rely on the private sector. We don't give the private sector any incentives. We want to attract private sectors. We don't give them security. We want to attract private sectors. We don't fight corruption. We want to attract private sector. We don't have a judicial system that are proud of for the time being. And there is the G. Now, the G, which is the government spending and investment, the government spending now is becoming higher, but the investment, it's approximately 0 or 5%. The government does not have money to invest in infrastructure or anything else. And what remains is the key, and this is what we need to concentrate on, is export minus imports. Now we import $19 billion. We export $3 billion. هون بيت القصيد وهون this is the solution of our our growth in the economy. Imagine that our export grows from 3 billion to 6 billion, which is $3 billion. This is around 6% of the GDP. So you add it to 2% growth in GDP, and we are at 8% GDP. So here we have to look at where we need to invest and do our job. Now, probably I described the situation in Lebanon and the structure of our economy. So we are aware of that as government. Me as a Minister of Economy has been lobbying since day one to create a macro sectorial economic plan that will be adopted by the whole government. And the reason for that, or the main scope of this work, is to first create the identity of Lebanon, or what we need Lebanon to be as economic model. Because now I described an economic model, which is we are living at. We don't even really know about it. The usual people, they don't understand this, what I described. But what do we really want the Lebanon to look like? Is it we want it as a model like, for example, Germany, heavy industries? We want it as Singapore, as Dubai. We want it as what kind of economy? What is our identity? What's our vision? So we have to identify, because if we identify it, we can put all the structure of the government policies and regulation around this, around what we want Lebanon to be. So this is one. Number two, we need to identify the sectors that we need to grow, the sectors that Lebanon has added value, that we really can do a difference, that we really can compete with the outside world. And when I say compete, i.e. to export. We have to identify these sectors. I can ask you, for example, every one of you, and you can tell me, each one of you, what you think we have an added value instinctively. But we need to put it on a piece of paper. We have to identify 5, 10, 15, 20 sectors and put all around it all the incentives and the protection from the government, i.e., for example, if we want to concentrate and say that we want to invest or to grow the hospitals in Lebanon, We can say, for example, that we will give all the hospitals all tax incentives for 10 years, give them the land for free, give them all, for example, the electricity bill is for free for also 5 years or 10 years, in order to attract the private investors to come and build hospitals, given that 30, 40, 50% of its clients come from abroad, for example. And now if we do that, for example, all the Gulf, we can attract all Gulf citizens to come and have their medication in Lebanon. They come, they will stay for long, they will bring their families, they will invest in Lebanon, etc. This is one simple sectors. I can tell you fashion, I can tell you technology, we can talk about many sectors that we have added value. What I'm trying to tell you is that we are not a bankrupt country. We are a rich country. We have money of $180 billion in banks in Lebanon. Probably we have as much of Lebanese money outside Lebanon in international banks, and we have the know-how. So we have the main two difficult things. The third thing, what we are missing is policies and government intervention to facilitate all of that in order to attract private investors to invest in infrastructure and to invest in these productive sectors in Lebanon. And what we need to do, and this is part of our plan, the third thing, is to create 1 or 2 pilot projects with a short to medium term that will be achieved and will create confidence to the people, to ourselves, and to the international community, and to investors. And we have to identify this 1 or 2 pilot projects, I say. 3 weeks ago, before what happened in the Council of Ministers, the Council gave me the authority or the mandate to sign with McKinsey as international consultant group for them to work with us to create this macro-sectorial economic plan and put it in work. We don't want to end up doing this plan and putting it in a drawer. And this is the challenge, because I'm sure now every one of you is telling me or thinking that many studies has been done for the last 20, 30 years, and we are not inventing the wheel. But the name of the game is to put it in action. To put it in action, we need to engage everybody. We need to engage the president, we need to engage Mr. Hariri, Mr. Berri, all the ministries. We have to engage the people, we have to engage the media, and we have to engage the private sector once we are doing this study. It's a study that is a practical study. It needs 6 months probably to finalize. I did not sign yet with McKinsey. I need 2 weeks to do that. And after this 6 months, we have to go directly vertical in these sectors and create vertically all the policies and procedures to promote them. And by doing all of that, we will create growth in our GDP that is in excess of 8%, more than the interest rate, more than the growth of the public debt. But what we need to achieve is we need to have one figure in front of our eyes, which is debt over GDP. We want to decrease it. If we don't do that, really we have a big problem, and we don't know what's the consequences. I'm not telling you today we will have a problem, but I can tell you probably in the future, if we don't do this, we will have a problem. But I can tell you also for sure that we have all the intention, and we are all aligned as government now to do this and to complete it in the best way ever.
Thank you. Thank you, Right. I just, one comment, I take it this macroeconomic plan that you have in mind is being done with the Ministry of Finance or without?
Everybody, including Ministry of Finance, definitely.
To tackle the issue of the fiscal deficit.
Of course.
Well, I'm going to open the floor for comments. I'm sure there must be very many questions. I have very many myself, but I'm going to forego my privilege of asking questions, and I will start. Would you like to begin? Yes. Yeah, please go ahead.
I need a microphone.
Yes.
Thank you. My name is Khalil Boueri. I own a water treatment firm since 40 years almost. Well, listening to you gentlemen, all of you are very expert in the field. I'm an engineer by formation. I did an EMBA just recently, but still, I'm not in a position now because what I heard is like habbi sikhni, habbi berdi. I heard many optimistic view and also some question marks which are very, very crucial for someone like us who is striving to keep the head above the water. Well, to Mr. Samir Hammoud, when you say, is it sustainable, the banking sector? You put the question with a big question mark. What is your view? How do you see it? This is one thing. Second thing for His Excellency. When you say we are going to support, projects coming from abroad like hospital, giving them free electricity, etc., and I'm sure some tax reduction. Why don't you apply it on industries like us, who is a medium-sized enterprise? And it is very difficult to compete against Turkish, against even the Emirates when we are producing our filter, sewage treatment plant, or reverse osmosis. The cost of electricity, etc. We don't feel a support from the government for an industry to not only to survive, to be sustainable. And Dr. Baz, what is the total capital of or equity of the banks? 20 billion. Sorry? 20 billion. 20 billion. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I'll take other questions.
I will try to just summarize as much as I can. Maybe my first question to Dr. Baz about the size of the loans, which you said like 60% from the total loan goes to private sector, yeah? No, goes to retail and SMEs. 40%.
Whereby we should reach
60
with respect to our per capita income.
All right. I really do believe if we want to maintain this sustainable development, social and economic development, we should really raise the size of the SME lending, because it's definitely goes to the, fighting unemployment and creating new jobs. Well, this is something that we really have to look at it if we really would like to have maintained a good economy. Now, I will try to make very, very brief. We definitely need to bring more dollars to our economy. And at the same time, we need to spend this money in the economy. I mean, not putting as a loan. We have around 180 billion as a loan. To me, maybe because we have a very high interest. When we pay 4 to 6% interest with a stable dollar rate, nobody would like to invest. I put my money in the bank, or I invest in the central bank, and I will not finance any economy. Now, talking about the GDP, it's like the total asset of the Lebanese bank is like 3 times the GDP. And by the way, this is something that really common in the Arab world. The size of the Arab banks in the Arab world is 140% of the GDP of the Arab world. The total asset of the Arab banks is almost $3.4 trillion, which is almost 140% of the GDP. And by the way, the total lending of the Arab banks is 75% of the GDP. This is something very common in our region. However, the 35% that you spoke about, Mr. Hammoud, about why the banks only finance 35%, this is not normal, because I think that we have a very high interest in the bank as well. Now, I understand the dilemma between choosing to bring dollars from outside, especially for the remittances, which is almost $8 billion a year, and at the same time lending this money in the market and have a high risk with the instability of the security and lack of laws and regulation from the government, which also is something that the government. That's all.
Thank you. Yes.
سيهون سمير
I'm taking one question,
No, no
one more question, and then I'll give you the floor.
I'm ahead of you.
Go ahead. I'll come back to you. تفضل.
He's waiting for
He
you.
wants the mic. Okay.
Hello, thank you. My question is to Dr. Baz, if possible. We heard that Bank Audi was last year was thinking about moving its HQ to the UAE. Was it, and why did it not? And why was it thinking about it? We read some articles about that.
Thank you. I'm going to take this round. Freddie, you want to start with you?
Yeah. For what I still remember, because there was many questions. I believe that the main question, I mean, which have been repeated by almost everyone, for me, it's quite amazing because there is currently a lot of recommendations which are being made with respect to the oil and gas, sector, on how Lebanon should avoid potentially a resource course with respect to oil and gas. All what you have been saying is a proof that Lebanon is living since ever a resource course nowadays. But dependency is not potentially to oil and gas as much it is to those easy and abundant recurrent inflows coming into the system, which have translated into increased consumption fueled by imports, with the dependency on inflows to finance, those imports, whereby it could have translated into more investments in high value added, like His Excellency, was recommending high value added activities, generating more inclusive and higher growth rates in the economy. But this is a major fundamental imbalance in Lebanon. And what probably is a little bit confusing for you is very legitimate, because this is the perception, from people which are not really, experts. We are indeed living fundamental imbalances in Lebanon, to a certain extent translating into vulnerabilities, to a certain extent, because Lebanon, by the way, never ever fell into any recessionary trap, despite the many setbacks we witnessed recently, but within the context of still very important buffers. This is what we call the strong technicalities. So people does not understand, the situation is under control. We have no concerns of any drift, but we are living, in the middle of fundamental vulnerabilities. But this is the reality. Because technically, indeed, it's very well contained, and there is a high level of resilience, but the underlying is not sustainable forever. When we say, I believe that what our friend Samir meant to say is that it's not sustainable. It's not that we are heading towards an imminent problem. Probably it's a wake-up call to the decision makers that it's about time to implement the long-awaited, reforms in order to restructure fundamentally the economy. Because let's forget about oil and gas. What is the required solution in order to exit from the current resource course? Is to shift our growth drivers from domestic demand to foreign demand. From domestic demand mainly fueled by consumption, as a matter of fact, generating those inflows, generating those huge current account deficits requiring inflows, to be offset, otherwise they will put at risk the foreign position and the exchange rate, towards external demand, mainly exports, and whatever kind of tourism, health, education, religious, etc., which would translate into investments with a bigger component of job creation. But an economy is not a jet ski, it's a tanker. It requires time. What I'm talking about probably would require decades in order to succeed, but we have to start somewhere. And this is something which requires a very important consensus among decision makers, more principally politicians and social partners to start with. And a critical success factor also will be the scope and depth of reforms, which in turn require a more active role from political parties and from the civil society in order to take a bigger part in the required political transition and to influence the course of politics. To be honest, personally, I am a politician. I have always been independent. I cannot identify myself to any political party in Lebanon. But as I was telling Samir in the beginning, of the conference, for the first time ever, after the election of President Aoun, we have started to hear a completely different economic speech. If you remember, we went to greet him as Association of Banks, and he said it first to us, and then he repeated it several times. He said it's about time for the Lebanese pound to be covered by real economic efficiency and not anymore by indebtedness. This is the exit from the current resource course. What Samir is worried about is for Lebanon, and also Raed, is Lebanon to keep on struggling, in this current resource course, which require inflows, which need to be highly paid, which represent a burden for the economy and for the banking sector. But when you import for $20 billion per year in Lebanon, it's not justified by the level of your domestic income. So this is, the main challenge for the Lebanese economy and for the banking industry. But just very quickly, Samir, I would wish if you can, cancel the taxes because they are unfair. No, let me tell you why, Samir. Because people are not aware. You know what is the revenue gap today in the budget?
You pay already 700.
8% of GDP. The revenue gap in the budget, difference between potential revenues and actual revenues, represent $4.5 billion. It's 8% of GDP. You know what is the required primary surplus in the budget to curb down debt ratios? 6%. So if you close 2/3 of the current gap, you don't need to add any new tax, especially under those sluggish, conditions in Lebanon. As a matter of principle, first. Second, I gave you the figures. When you represent 7% of the economy and you pay up to 30% of tax on profit, when you represent 1.5% of the labor force and taxes on salaries and wages paid by banks, withheld by banks and paid to the Ministry of Finance, represent 24% of the total. I am proud to say, by the way, that Bank Audi is the largest taxpayer in Lebanon as a single entity. I'm proud to say it, but it's not fair. Why it's not fair? It's not fair because the impact of the new taxation on banks represents $350 million.
How much tax are you gonna pay the government after this rules?
No.
Say, 80?
$350 million, just because it's important. You know how much it represents in foregone ROE for banks? 1%. In foregone ROE for banks, and they're already very low performance.
But Dr. Baz, you invest too much outside Lebanon, and mainly most of your money coming from outside Lebanon. Also, you're taking a very high risk from Turkey, no?
I'm sorry, I have to give the chance to other questions to be asked. Go ahead. Sorry.
You asked me about hospitals. I gave an example, but this is not what we need to do only. We want to identify these industries that we have an added value. It could be SMEs, or it could be whatever, but we need to identify them and work accordingly. So it might be this industry or other industry or whatever. Second of all, what we need to do, and the example of Singapore that Dr. Baz gave, for me, also, I always look at Singapore. I think Lebanon should do the same as Singapore because it has a lot of similarities. The GDP of Singapore is more than $400 billion. You know that they have the third refineries in the world and they don't have one single drop of oil? Okay. Lebanon as, okay. You know, but most of the people, they
another
don't know.
sectarian country similar to Lebanon and surrounded also by a lot of troubleshooters.
They have also difficult neighbors. Internally, they have from different sects. They used to have a lot of corruption. Now they lost corruption. They are a small country. So what we need to do is very simple. Lebanon, geographically, and from the days of the Fini'iyin, our identity is traders, and we do semi-manufacturers. What we need to do is we need to create free economic zones all over Lebanon, from north to Bekaa, and to be able to attract all the goods, نرجع منصنعهم نعملهم repackaging, all of that, and send it to the rest of the world, like Jabal Ali, and make it like Singapore. We're not inventing the wheel. With this, Lebanon, the size of Lebanon and the population in Lebanon, no constraint for the growth of the GDP. I'm giving you, he gave you the example of Singapore. I'm telling you, really, we are better than Singapore. And I met the Singaporean economic minister 3 months ago. I was in Saudi Arabia. He told me, we sometimes give Lebanon as an example once we do speeches and etc. Now, because they say that the Lebanese entrepreneurs are the best in the world. This is our added value. Why don't we capitalize on that? Everybody has an added value and has his weaknesses. We have a lot of added value. The main weakness is government policies.
Thank you. Excuse me.
Sorry.
Samir Hammoud.
Yes.
I think you're...
Not to mix up, for myself, not to mix up things, I concentrated on the banking position, and I said on the sustainability of that model business. Now, you know, everybody is hearing that the interest now has gone up. Banks are paying on the dollars 6 and above, and paying on the Lebanese pound 8 and above. So what's that economy that would take the money from outside 6 times, 5 times of the advanced countries, and that will lend 6, 7 times the advanced countries? And you say that we want to boost the economy. And if we do not do that, we have a problem. We cannot downsize. We want the dollar to come into the country. The banks is bringing the money. He has no problem. Then he is lending to the economy, or putting with the central bank, or giving to the government, and he making a reward spread. This is slim. It is somehow small, but he is making this spread. We want, yes, I wish, I do not contest what the gentleman said. On the contrary, now we have 2 areas that are at hand. Look at the current account in the golden age, in the golden days. What about? Are we promoting and boosting and making the atmosphere and the environment for tourism? We are not. Listen, please. Second, are we going somehow now exploring the possibility of what we call the LO is issued under the PPP for the infrastructure? We, under the current account, we had 2 accounts that we should not even decline or undermine, or even we should underline them. We had the tourism that was an export inside. Every time that you have tourism, this is an export of the services. And second, more important, that we had investments in the real estate, which is now a sluggish industry, a very slow industry in the real estate sector. So I wish the banking sector would regain his momentum and his also core role, that we bring the deposit from everywhere, and we have also the cleverness to bring the deposits, and we invest where? In the economy.
Productive.
In the economy. With the central bank, it is burden on the economy. With the government, it is burden on the economy. I do not contest, I agree fully with them. We are looking for these economic areas to be revived, where the central or with the banking sector would replay his role. I'm just concentrating on the role of the banks. I agree with them totally on the economic side.
Thank you, Samir. I'm going to give you the chance to. But let me raise one question, if I may. I mean, you've diagnosed the issues and you've said what ought to be done. Why hasn't this been done for the last 20 years, 30 years in Lebanon, when there is expertise, there is knowledge, and there is entrepreneurship, and there is a huge human capital, but we have failed? Are we talking about the political elite of the past?
Yes.
This is just for you, but let me give the chance to Munir. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Samir. Munir Rashid from the Ministry of Finance. First, I would like to have a remark regarding what Mr. Baz said. Bank Audi is not the largest taxpayer. It's the Lebanese consumer who is the largest taxpayer. But let me continue. First, corporate taxes in Lebanon are 7% of total revenue, which means that 93% of revenues are paid by the consumer, because Lebanon depends largely on indirect taxes. This is just a correction. Another thing, banks are not the backbone of the Lebanese economy, because the government of Lebanon is the backbone of the Lebanese banks. You make $2 billion in profits. Most of it is from the public sector. Okay? So the issue is what has led to this situation, because we have to address it. We cannot easily shift demand to outside, promote exports. You have the issue of competitiveness and the exchange rate in very critical areas that we can manipulate. You know, as he mentioned, the Mr. over there, that you know, we are not competitive. Competitiveness is the prime issue with the deficiency in the power sector and transportation and all these sectors and our labor force. So we cannot compete easily with abroad, in addition to the constraints that are from the government regulations and so on, and syndicates and so forth. So these are the main issue is how, first, why we have reached this stage, and we are continuing with the same policies, and how can we, what are the main reasons, you know, because we see, as you mentioned, Mr. Hamoud, we have an interest rate that's much larger than the growth rate. It's very difficult to reach a growth rate of even nominal terms to 7%. So the economy is not going to grow as long as we are what we are now. So we have to address the policies that reached where we are today, and the prime culprits are the fiscal and also the fixed exchange rate, because the fixed exchange rate, once we fix the exchange rate, we cannot use it as an instrument. It's already fixed. It's out of the game. Now we have to go to the fiscal, and the fiscal with what's happening, although the fiscal has you know, good signs, we are not reaching a catastrophic situation, because most people don't know that we have primary surplus. We have a primary surplus the first 6 months of $1.5 billion. Had we not had the debt we have and the interest payments that we are paying, then we have a surplus in the budget. Our revenues exceed our spending without interest by $1.5 billion. So we have to go to the roots and study these problems. These McKinsey and others may help, but I'm not so sure that they can really tackle the core problem that we are facing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Munir. Yes, I'll take 2 more questions. Yes, go ahead.
Good evening. My question to His Excellency Mr. Raed Khouri, and my question may intersect with Dr. Samir's question. As you may agree with me that the main issue is not in the finding solution, because we have many proposals for many problems. I see the issue is in the implementation, and as you said, you agreed with McKinsey for next 6 months. Who guarantee the implementation of this project or the subsequent project? Yes, thank you.
Yes, Layal.
The
Mike.
Good evening. Thank you for your presentations. I have a small question about the macro-sectorial economic plan. So is it a study about different sectors to see if they are linked, interconnected, and to see if we boost or we change any policy, how it will affect the whole economy? Is it this topic, the macro-sectorial economic plan? So, thank you.
Leila, did you have a question? No. All right. Okay, I'll take one more, and I'm going to give the floor to the panel.
Good evening. I would like please to ask the question to Mr. Hamoud. 2 weeks ago, after the cabinet crisis, we saw that most of the Lebanese started running to the banks to transfer their money into the dollar currency. So in case this crisis continues, how do you see the stability of the Lebanese pound? Thank you.
Thanks. Frederick, would you like to start answering this comment?
Yeah. Very quickly, I believe that you have been saying exactly the same. What you consider as being obstacles are for me the solutions. But we are talking exactly about the same. I mean, the resource course I was defining, this is what you have described, but this is something, I mean, again, which require a wide involvement from all active forces. I mean, technically, I mean, if I have to be very simple, independently of the quality of the reserves, because when you are facing a systemic risk, the financial industry is one party. So we're not talking anymore in terms of central bank and banks. We are talking about the banking sector. Technically today, the foreign assets at the central bank represent almost 83% of the money supply in local currency. If we add gold, we are at 100%, so it's almost a currency board. Okay? If we add the foreign currency reserves at the central bank to the liquidity which is held by commercial banks with their correspondent abroad, we have close to $50 billion of liquidity, which represent almost 50% of the deposit base in foreign currency in order to assess the money transfer abroad risk. So however you look at it, this is what I meant by technically the situation is to a large extent contained. Because we have the means, I mean, to ensure the coverage of the conversion of 80% of the money supply in local currency, whereby historically, if we take two tail events in the stress testing, the assassination of late Prime Minister Hariri and the summer war with Israel, because those are the most two relevant examples. We have had close to 5–6% of the money supply in local currency which have been converted. We are still much within, the capacity. And if we consider the risk of transferring fixed deposits from inside abroad, the joint central money, because you need to have central money, in order to be able to transfer abroad, because by transferring your deposit abroad, I need to provide the correspondent bank with an equivalent amount in order to tell the correspondent bank, please credit Mr. X account. We have a central money cushion of almost 50% of the deposit base in foreign currency, which means that, there is still a lot of important buffers in order to sustain. But again, I don't like, because the capacity of banks to sustain fundamental imbalances, this is what have been generating the laxity among politicians and decision makers. So I'm frustrated, I'm frustrated personally, because it's about time in order to strengthen decision makers, not to provide them with comfort that if you continue your corruption, if you continue your waste, if you continue your laxity, don't worry, there is Mr. Salami and there is the banking industry with all their strengths and muscles which can, compensate. We should not compensate anymore.
Thank you. Sorry. How do you feel?
لا very good.
Very well.
خليني أحكي هيدا اللي
No.
بدك بدك
You don't
السيكتورز
need to
البقيه
shrink. The economy need to expand.
صح.
Exactly.
ده خليني احكي بالعربي من الاخر.
Does anybody not understand? Anyone does not understand?
There is one who doesn't understand Arabic.
Who?
Can you translate?
Sorry, sorry, we have to speak in English. I'm
طيب
sorry.
اوكي.
No, maybe he can someone translate? Maybe I can.
Yeah, no problem.
He can express himself.
No problem.
ولو
Now,
تلميذ
first of all,
تلميذ اليسوعية عم يحكي بالانجليزي وانت تلميذ اليهودي بدك تحكي بالعربي.
لا بدي سب كيف بدي سب بالعربي بالانجليزي.
هذه between parentheses.
No, okay. كلكم
Yeah,
يعني
حدث.
all of you are asking the same question. Why now it will work while we all know the solution, and it didn't work before. First of all, it because our mentality, our Lebanese mentality, is that we think short term. And now Dr. Baz said yes, but this will take 10 years, 15 years. But had we had done this in 1990, where we have now long term is a series of short term. مش هيك بعلموكم؟ Okay, so we have to have a major master plan اللي هي 5 years, 10 years, and then we have to have short measures, medium measures. But at least we need, why the government is a government? Government, because it needs to put a plan and execute it. First of all, our mentality, our culture is short term. Can the people, citizens, politicians, the media, everybody, we are short terms. The only long-term people are the industrials, because they invest money, they start taking money out of 5 years. And what we need the industries. And this is our problem. So 1. 2, because we have always witnessed instability, insecurity, and in our system, our political system in Lebanon, we have always been, in many times, we don't have a president, we don't have a working government, we don't have, we have always problems with non-functioning of the administration, all of that for the last 25 years. But why now? First, because we have reached a stage that we cannot continue. It's as simple as that. Yeah. Before we could have continued, and we could have postponed the problem. So we did postpone the problem. But now there is no way. So what Dr. Baz is saying, this is exactly what I did. First of all, I described the situation for the President, for Prime Minister Hariri, for His Excellency Mr. Berri, the same thing. I presented them the situation not in the good way. I told them that we are reaching a situation where there will be no back. We cannot go. I started by doing that. And this is why, for the time being, I succeeded on one thing, that they gave me the mandate to work with McKinsey to do this job. And I told them, if we don't work all together with all the relevant ministries, with all the private sectors, we will not reach a conclusion. Even the budget, that we do it on a yearly basis, we never think of the budget as part of an economic plan. I am the member I am minister and member of the cabinet, and the way we put the budget has no relevant to any economic plan or economic growth. That we look at it that we're gonna always put taxes and take money. We don't look about how to decrease taxes sometimes to promote certain industries, to create growth, to create more profitability, and then we can take taxes from them. We don't think like that. But believe me, I can tell you for the first time, now there is a chance. How much the chance is? Before it's 0, 10%, now there is 40, 50% chance that we can reach a conclusion for that.
Thank you.
Your question, from day one, from the hour we heard about the resignation of Prime Minister Hariri, as a regulator and also the central bank, and we have discussions with the central bank, we were not worried about the price and the value of the Lebanese pound vis-à-vis the dollar. We were not worried. We are worried about the consequences of that, and particularly what you are seeing right now is the increase of interest and somehow the surging cost of the monetary mass. And this is something, it's coupled with somehow increase of the taxes from the Ministry of Finance. And when we say that we want to boost economy, how come that you go increase of interest rate and increase of tax rate? This is something, we are worried about that. But we took some measures. For example, when you say that in 1984, and I lived that situation, it's not only the conversion of the people, their deposits into dollars that would put pressure on the Lebanese pound. It's one. There are three other items. I don't know if I have to repeat them or to say them because somehow it raised some red flags and bad memories. But among them, we stopped that we did not accept the banks to go into converting their debt into dollars into Lebanese pound. Because this is also a trigger and more pressure will be put on the Lebanese pound. If you have your money, it's okay. It is free. We do not even interfere. It's free to convert your Lebanese pound into dollars. We'll not stop it. But we'll not give you the Lebanese pound to convert into dollars. So this is important that we will not. This is the real speculation. That this is called Ponzi even, not even speculative transaction. Ponzi transactions. And you have to make sure that we are now more comfortable than before, for good reasons or bad reasons, whatever, that the flight of money is not easy today. That even if you convert your money into dollars, the dollars is remaining in Lebanon, is remaining inside. So we were not concerned. We, as I said, we are concerned about the future, and we have to address the future, not from the side of a feared person, from a concerned person, from a responsible person. I'm not saying you have to worry that next year everything will be disaster. It's not like that. Lebanon is rich, Lebanon is good, and Lebanon is productive, but we have to work. We have to think. We have to plan. We have to implement. And there is somehow, right now, we believe that there is a determination and perseverance by the responsible people that this should take its place. Hopefully it will come.
Thank you, Samir. We have 2 more minutes, Leila. We have 2 more minutes. But I'd like to go back to something that Munir Rashid said. He outlined 2 major issues, the fiscal deficit and the exchange rate. And nobody will disagree about the importance, the crucial importance of having to resolve the fiscal deficit, because this is where it all starts. من هون بنبلش. But you raised the question about the exchange rate, and I just like when 20 seconds, if I may ask the panel whether they believe that we should continue with defending the exchange rate and having fixed exchange rate policy. In 20 seconds.
20 seconds. It's called the trust, will not sacrifice the trust and confidence we built over 25 years. Will not benefit. No, will defend.
Raed, anything to say on this?
Yeah, I mean, it's the trust, I agree, and now we cannot go backward. This could have been done probably 10 years ago with a plan, economic plan that would have done 10 years ago. Then now we would have really done, we have a floating rate, but today we cannot do it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's not a push button decision, yes or no. Definitely no. We shouldn't stop. I mean, it has to come naturally, because the social and the financial cost for Lebanon is a huge, with respect, I mean, to what the central bank is incurring as financial engineering cost, which has been considered, which has been deemed also considerable. Something which is very important, Samir, also, which very little people knows. It's true that the banks have achieved $5.5 billion of exceptional revenues last year throughout the financial engineering. And there was a circular of the central bank instructing banks how to use those proceeds. But the final check was $7 billion. So I've got 5.5, but there is a shortfall of 1.5, which will be incurred, again by our own funds. If you consider the increase in the CAR ratio from 12 to 15, so 2% additional collective provision on consolidated risk-weighted assets on loans, the depreciation of goodwill, and all what has been required, the total bill for banks is close to $7 billion. So banks will have to incur throughout their bottom lines.
بتبكينا يا فريدي. بدك كل شيء يساعدك هو تجيبوا شوية مصاري من برا كمان حطوهم بالاكويتي.
Our time is up. Would you please join me in thanking our panel for a very
So thank you everyone for being here. We have some coffee and pastries in the next room. And also all of this session will be on YouTube by tonight or tomorrow morning. I'll be posting a link. Please visit our Facebook page. So /AUBIFE, like our page and you can view the session or forward it to someone. So please to the next room. We have some really good food.